All right, I'm over in the render tab now, and just again looking at the League Rigs images, there's some pretty sophisticated shading going on here. It looks like there's a bit of a shading by height, right? So the deep crevices are getting a much darker color, while the top ones are sort of snow capped. But there's a lot of variation in between, right? There's this sort of blues and greens and even pinks, and a lot of these guys look like they change color along the length. Like these are a little bit bluer up top and a little pinker below. Same with some of these other guys. And, we want to get some of that subtle variation in there. And there's just a lot going on. It's a lot more sophisticated than just a color by height, right? So let's go back over here and I'm going to do a couple of things. One, taking a look at the prototype. Let's go to the UV texture view and I guess select the, does it have to be visible? I guess it does. So I'm not really concerned about mapping an image or something to these prototypes. What I do want to do is use UV values, particularly the V value, in the shader tree to help isolate some regions of the prototype. So these guys, just pressing W, and I'm actually going to make sure, tear off is selected because I'm going to rip those guys off, the two wings there. These, if you look at the 3D view, are the polygons at the top or bottom of the sides, right? And so the top ones, let's just Alt-1 to convert those to points. Let's go to the top here. So I want to press F2 to bring up my modeling palette, and I want to set those specifically under the UV tab here. Under Edit UVs, set value, V to 1. So let's get those up at 1 and lasso those guys. And same deal. I just did Control R there, which repeats the last command. We'll set V to 0. So we have 0 to 1 V values. The top and bottom polys aren't real important right now. I'll just move them back over, and I may deal with those later. But okay, going back to the 3D view, or actually we can sit over here, the gradient editor, and in the shader tree, add a layer, and under processing, let's add a gradient. And the gradient's input parameter, under sample parameters, I'm going to select texture V. And then if I edit the gradient, it's the annoying thing, I don't have to edit the gradient, it's just right here, right? In my gradient tab that's already there. This guy, let's do this sort of purpley, middle click at 1 roughly. You can select it and make it 1 exactly, and make it green. And okay, this is not what I expected. I expected green and purple, not sort of tan and purple, so something's a little bit off here. Looking at the gradient, let's change the projection type to UV and select the UV map texture. And there's what I was looking for, right? So make sure you set your texture locator to UV map when you're using the UV input parameter. So, okay, so this is cool. So I've got a gradient here. So that's not how I want to texture it, but what I want to do is I'm going to use this as a mask, right? So masks actually use values instead of colors. So under value, let's just go like this and make this a 1 and make this 0, 0. You'll notice I have this set to auto flat, and so there's a little bit of an ease in and ease out, and I think that's fine. That just crunches the colors at the top and bottom a little bit. All right, so we have this gradient here, and I'm going to turn off variation texture for a moment, and I'm going to add just a couple of constants. So processing, constant, and this one will be, we'll just stick with our green, and actually let's not do that. Let's do a bit of a blue, and duplicate the constant, and a bit of a pink, maybe, pinkish, purplish. And then my gradient, I'm going to put between them and right click, and under special effects, actually not special effects, surface shading, I'm going to turn that into a, not surface shading, what is shader control, right? A layer mask. So this is what I was kind of looking for, right? We've got, and the reason this is again, the layer masks use value. That's why if I were to change this to 0 here, then it's all blue. That's why I changed the value. I started with color just to get an idea of what it would look like, but changed the value. Okay, so there's the layer mask. And so we've got this sort of change along the length. Okay, that's one of the things I'm looking for is a change along the length. The other thing I'm looking for is a change in color due to altitude. So I'm going to turn these guys off for now and add another gradient. And incidence is not what we want. We actually want a sample parameter, and we're going to use, actually we'll use a y distance to locator. And the y distance to locator, the locator they are talking about is actually this texture locator here. So in the 3D view, the locator we were talking about, I think our texture locators are hidden, but it's, let me just press the transform key here to make it visible, and I'm not sure if toggle texture locators is, that guy is on, yep, there he is. So this is the, I am in poly mode, make sure you're in item mode. This is the texture locator right there. Okay, so that's what we're talking about in terms of distance to locator. We're distance to that locator, which is at 0, 0, 0. So that's fine. So under color, we'll just go to our graph editor, and this is active. So again, let's do something a little obvious here. So side view, go like this, and let's look at our units here. Our grid is 100 millimeters, so zoom in a little bit, or maybe I'll zoom out a little bit. So our grid is 200 millimeters, so 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. So that's about a meter high, the highest, a little bit less than a meter. So looking at our gradient, if we put another key right around a meter and change that color, you'll see we've got some altitude-based colors going on here. And so, you know, in Lee's images, he really crunched down a couple of things. So, you know, I may actually crunch this in like that, and then do like a hard contrast between the ocean colors and the altitude, higher altitude colors like that. Maybe I'll do something like this, then add in something a little more purpley, you know, something like that. Actually, maybe a little more like whitish. So again, I'm not really going for looks here at the moment. I'm just trying to show how we can you know, get these colors going. So excellent. So we have some color going on altitude now. Let me just feather this a little bit and move it this way a little. I'm just trying to bring it in line with our water line here. Okay, that's a little better. Maybe feather that a little bit. And crunch this down a little, make another one here, a little darker blue, and crunch it up this way. All right, that's a little too blue. Again, I'm getting caught up in trying to make this look pretty. That's not the point right now. So anyway, we've got some altitude-based or height-based shading going on, but there's no variation going on right now. At all. So we've got to figure out a way to add variation to all of these guys, also have height-based color, and also have some variation along the length. So we got to bring all these things together. All right, so now that we see how the gradient on height works, let's go ahead and start making a real image here. I'm going to turn that off for now. Alrighty, the shader tree is getting a little bit cluttered, so these are the initial constants and variation texture, and then this gradient for diffuse map I had used to demonstrate some things. I'm going to hide those, put them in a group, Control G and hide them right now. This gradient, I'm just going to name it like, call it temp height gradient or something like that. Come on, rename, you can do it, rename. Temp height grad. Okay, so we'll get back to temp height grad. So I'm going to add a processing variation texture. And this goes back into play where we had the particle ID randomized throughout the whole thing. So let's edit the gradient. So we're selected here. So we have the gradient guy here. So we don't have to click edit gradient. It's right here. And clicking on 100, this will be our range. I'm going to look at the variation for the ocean, the floor here right now. And these are really sort of a dark blue, sort of desaturated color he had in his sample image, in Lee Griggs image. And so I'm just going to start off doing that. Some blues and greens, really dark, a little desaturated. You can kind of see them coming in here, probably middle click, add a few more variations, just get my hue moving in there a little bit, maybe even some purpley ones, but maybe really desaturated purpley ones like that, a little darker. There's too purpley, maybe a little more bluey. So here's, yeah, so that's looking kind of cool here. Maybe not quite dark enough, but we'll slide a few of these down. That'll change with the lighting as well. But we just want that down there at the bottom, right? So we'll rename this Ocean Variation Texture, okay? Alrighty, right click and duplicate. And this variation texture, based on the particle ID, is going to be for the sort of mid areas, right? Sort of the mid height areas. So all of those are sort of a cool bluey and cyany color. So let me bump some of these guys up. I'm doing this kind of quickly. So I'm not really going for an artistic masterpiece here. This is still let's take a look at how we do this state of things. And then the last part, I'll actually try to make a pretty image with my artistic skills. Okay, so that's good. All right, we're good there. So we've got ocean, we've got midtones, then we've got, let's rename this mid-altitude variation texture. And then, of course, we have our snow-capped peaks, our lovely snow-capped peaks, which we will call top altitude variation texture. And these guys at the top, I'm just going to sort of pull them in towards white and up the brightness a little bit, pull it in towards white, up the brightness, maybe even just pull it in a little, up the brightness, desaturate, up the brightness. Okay, so there's our snowy peaks, but there is still a little bit of variation in color there, not a ton. We just pull a little more saturation into these. All right, looking good. All right, so obviously you're going to guess correctly that we're going to use our height grad to mask these various variation grads. So pull this on the top here, and I'm going to turn it back on. Now remember, layer masks don't use color values, they use value values. So I'm going to select a value here, and I'm going to select the red channel as well, just so I can see where my keys were initially. And on my value, I'll just middle click some keys there, and I can hide the red now and just stick with the value and bring these down to 0 and just enter them as 0. And I'm going to just drag and drop this on that top texture, and that's automatically going to turn into a layer mask. So you can see at the top here, I've got a little bit of the white snowy peaks, okay? And so I actually want a little more of those. Drag that down, maybe middle click and get something a little higher here. So white snowy peaks, looks good, okay. What can we do? What I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this guy. I'm pretty sure there's an issue where, so I hit duplicate, but I'm not getting anything, right? I'm going to undo that. I don't believe you can duplicate a embedded layer mask layer in the shader tree. It seems kind of weird, so I'm going to un-shader mask that, and then I'm going to duplicate it, and I'm going to re-shader mask the top, and then I'm going to take this and layer mask the midtones as well. So when we edit those, so again, we're doing value. Okay, so this is we want the height map there, and we're just doing the midtones. So let's drag these further down. We're bringing some of those mids down. I don't have to worry about this. I don't have to black out the top because of the layered nature of the shader tree. The whites are on top anyway, so that can stay up at 100. If you follow me, right? So these guys are on top, the whites, so I don't have to alpha them out on the layer below it because there's already some layering going on. I just want to drag down to ocean level. So let me crunch these together a little bit and scooch them down to ocean-ish level like this. Maybe you could do a little feather between like that, and then I'll pull this guy back up to 100, 10, 100. There we go. Okay, so we've got 3 different levels of variation going on now. We've got height-based first of all, we have per particle variation. We also have a variety of colors based on height. So we're getting there. Actually, I think this needs to be a little bit smoother there. Okay, it's a little bit more feathered, I think, on these guys. So, this is all diffuse color, right? So this is looking pretty good, and I'm going to close these up. But remember, we also had some variation along the length of these guys, and if you remember way back here, this layer mask I made earlier with using the sampled V parameter of the UV map, and I'm just going to grab this constant as well and pull it up. So let's drag these on top and turn them on. So this constant is what? Pink, and we've got our gradient here. So if you look, if I push in, you'll see that I've got this pink starting from the top and going down, right? Starting from the top and going down, even on these little side guys, starting from the top and going down and feeding into the variation textures below. So a couple of things. One, I don't want to apply variation to the tops of these. I like the tops. I want to apply variation to the bottoms going up. So I want to alter the bottom of these elongated cubes a little bit. So I'm going to actually flip this. Let's make this 100 and make this one 0. I could probably just hit invert over here, but I'm going to do it this way. So now I've got pink traveling up from the bottom, which is a little bit interesting, and but not entirely what I want. I don't want pink, so I'm going to delete this constant texture there, and I'm going to add it looks weird because this layer mask is gradiating into nothing. So let me just add a process and a processing and a process node. So right now, I can actually take this layer mask and drag it on the process node. You get a little plus there. And so the process node is really interesting because all I want to do is shift the colors a little bit at the bottom of these. So if I do a big shift, like, these are, again, it's not a 360-degree hue. It's normalized between 0 and 100. So a 50% hue shift is going to go to the other side of the color palette. Is that correct? Or maybe it's 100% hue shift goes to the yellow. Yeah, so 100% hue shift. Yellow is complementary of blue, and I'm just doing this to sort of show you. I don't want this much variation here, but so I'm adjusting from the bottom up, but I want it subtle, right? I want it really subtle. So let's say like a hue of maybe 15 and a saturation of maybe 20%. In fact, that's way too much. Let's do a saturation of maybe 7% or something. And again, I think this is a little too much. I just want it subtle, so maybe 10 and 7. And so again, we're sort of back at if I hide the process, there's our original look. All right, nice variations on height. And if I add this in, each one of these textures gets some variation along the length of it as well. So I push in here, let's just push in, not down there, but over here, you see some variation along the length of that. And if I turn off the process, it's all back to basically the same color. So that's what I'm looking at there. So some cool variation on along the length of these guys. But we can do a little bit more. I actually want to do something kind of interesting. What I noticed on some of his is there may be some variation on incidence angle, where some of these acute angles, some of these acute faces are really picking up another color. So I'm going to, again, add another process node. Processing. Process. Okay. And if I just do 100% hue shift, well, it's just going to bring everything to the other side of the color wheels. And I'm just doing that right now to exaggerate the effect so I can place it where I want to. And go over here, and I'm going to do another gradient. Gradients in Modo are just friggin' awesome, let me just say, because I've used Maya, and I've even used Slim and RenderMan, some of these other programs with nodal-based shading. And Modo's got this as well now. You can do some great stuff with node-based shading in Modo. But what I like about gradients in Modo is I don't have to hook up an input parameter to the instance. I just have a ton of them at my disposal, and this is artist friendly. This is working very quickly. So I could do a sample parameter or a surface parameter like incidence angle. And again, we're working with value here because this is going to be a layer mask, right? So we'll just do layer mask and drag it between this process node. And right now everything's 100%, so I'm getting the full process node on everything. But what I want is just the really oblique angles at 100% to get that sort of yellow color. So I'm bringing this down. I'm going to right click and drag this over. So really only the really oblique angles, and in fact I may even drag this over a little bit, get that shading difference. See that coming in there and it coming a little bit because of the perspective of the camera, I'm getting it across there. So I don't want yellow, but again, I like this color variation going on. I'm just adding complexity to the image using these really nice gradient input parameters. And so experiment, try some other things here. The process node, I'm actually just going to do a slight hue of maybe 20%. And maybe we dump the saturation, maybe make it a 15% and make it a little bit grayer on these guys, maybe on these side edges here, a little bit grayer, like that. Negative 20%. So, does negative saturation work? It should, right? If I do negative 100, it should be gray. Yeah, it does. So maybe negative 20. So again, I'm adding some more visual complexity here, right? A little bit of tints here on angles. Okay, that's looking kind of cool. In fact, I think hue's maybe just a little even too much. Let me just knock that in half. So I've got a little bit here, and of course you can undo that. One kind of cool thing is I can, let's see, if I split this, get a little side-by-side comparison here, and pause this guy. So let this guy render out, render out, render out, render out, with the process node on. Okay, looks pretty clear. Moto's pretty quick at this stuff. Pause that, unpause this, and turn off the process node, and let it render for a second. And then until it gets a little bit clear here. And again, maybe this is, you can't do A/B comparisons if I do the full F9 render, but this is just a nice way of just taking a quick peek here. I can see I don't have that purpley oblique angle shading going on here that I do here. And so it's just a nice way to compare and see the difference. I actually kind of like that. I'm also getting a little bit of purpley up top on some of these guys as well, because the oblique angle going on there. Acute angle, acute or oblique? Is that the same thing? I don't think so. I need to go back to geometry. Okay, so you can break your wrist and do your prehensile tail slash and burn. Thank you, big stupid pie menu. And I'll turn that back on. Okay, so things are starting to look kind of interesting here. I'm going to unpause this. Let's start making, I said I wasn't going to make a pretty picture here, but I just can't help myself. Let's try to make this look a little bit pretty. So the first thing I'm going to do is this aspect ratio is idiotic, right? 720 by 480. Okay, we are still in DV camera days. My DV 720 480p camera. Sweet. So let's do 960 and sort of an ultra wide aspect, maybe 400. So we'll do something like that. Okay, that's much better than where we were. Now I'm going to do something that I bet you don't know how to do. Even you experienced moto guys, I bet you have no idea what I'm about to do here. So I'm going to grab all these, Control G to group. Okay, so they're all in there in my Control G group, and I'm going to rename the group Diffuse Color. And now I'm going to right-click on this and right-click on the group, mind you. The group. I'm going to right-click on the group and say Basic, Diffuse Color. And you'll notice inside the group, these all sort of grayed out, except the layer masks. Layer masks are still being layer masks, and this hasn't changed. But I can duplicate this entire group of guys like this, and I can say right-click, and instead of diffuse color, I'm going to go to basic, and I'm going to go to subsurface color. So I bet you guys did not know how to do that. Notice these all changed in the subsurface color. If you're saying, I did know how to do that, I think you're a liar. You do not know how to do that. I think that's a special little thing only I knew. Probably not, but anyway, it's pretty cool, right? So why did I do that? I will show you in a minute as soon as I rename that. We'll split this bad boy here and pause these for a second, and I'm going to add a render output. So render outputs, let's do basic, and actually no, let's do material and diffuse color, and I'm going to add another render outputs, material and diffuse color. If you're not using 801, I think this is reorganized, these lists in 801, so if you're using 701, you might be like, it's a weird list, I don't understand. But anyway, it's subsurface color. They're all there. And then I'm going to go up here and change this to subsurface, and I'm going to change this to diffuse. And I'm going over to my render guy here, and under global illumination, I do want indirect to affect SSS, and we'll just stick with that for now. So this is all good. And now remember, the shader tree, I haven't masked anything. Nothing. There's only one piece of geometry in this entire scene, so there's no masking going on. These point to no. These don't point to any material masks or anything, or items or anything. They're just there, and that's fine with this scene. And of course, you can get more specific later on if we want a really complex stuff. But we're good where we're at. So the base material is providing all material properties. These are just applying properties to the diffuse color and subsurface channels right now. So under, I'm going to turn on conserve energy. I'm going to turn off spec for now, and I'm going to turn diffuse down to say 50. And oh, you know what I'm going to do? Let's do this. So let's go add layer, processing, variation texture, and I'm just going to drag this down here and change this to diffuse amount. Basic diffuse amount, and duplicate. We'll change this to subsurface amount. Whoops, basic subsurface amount. So we're going to add some different diffuse and subsurface amounts on a per particle basis here. So I have both of these paused. I'm just going to press F8 to bring up yet another render preview just for fun. And I'm actually going to pull out here a little bit. Take a look at what's going on here. So under shading, let's go shading effects, basic diffuse amount. And this variation texture on diffuse amount is set to particle IDs. So of course it's all 100% right now. So make a middle mouse click and bring this down to, see we were doing diffuse amount. So I think around 50, maybe we'll do between 30 and 50 or so. Maybe bring this down to, maybe we'll do 20. And then I'm going to just add a couple more in here and just do a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Maybe one more right here, a little bit higher there. So I'm sort of altering the diffuse amount there, right? Actually, the easy way to do this is to delete that guy and duplicate this guy, since I already spent all this time creating keyframes. Set this to subsurface amount. It's nice to have that sort of recent effects there. And of course I'm going to set this to shading effects, basic, subsurface amount. And of course it's the same thing, but I'm going to mix it up by doing stuff like this. And I want a little more subsurface color than diffuse color just to show through. So I'm going to take all of my keys and just pull them up a little bit brighter there. But we can make our valleys deeper. So this will be interesting. So awesome. So get rid of that guy. So we've got some variation on per particle on subsurface amount and diffuse amount. And when I unpause these, we'll see this one, if you remember, is set to subsurface color, and this one is set to diffuse color. And what I want to do is over here on subsurface color, I'm going to add yet another process node at the top, but completely unmasked. I just want to shift my subsurface colors a little bit. So maybe 30% in hue and 15 in saturation. So I'm going to change my subsurface colors to be different than my diffuse colors. Okay, so you can see what I'm doing here, the subsurface colors. Maybe it's a little. So again, this is not shading. This is just the channel values. So there's no shading going on here. It looks really intense right now, but there's no shading. It's just pure channel values. So once we have shading, these will be less intense. So but that's diffuse, that's subsurface, and of course, these are going to combine to form a really cool looking image. So let me break my hand and remove that. Control Shift tilde. Seriously, man. Okay. Let's turn this back to shading. I don't really need these guys on. I'll turn those off for now. And so, okay, this is starting to look pretty interesting. We've got all kinds of variations going on now. We've got an interplay between subsurface color and diffuse color. We've got height-based shading. We've got shading along the length. We've got sort of an angle-based shading as well. So we've got all kinds of cool stuff going on. I'm going to push in a little bit because now we've got to find some sort of interesting angle maybe to view these at. Maybe like this. You'll notice in all of Lee Griggs's images, he doesn't have a horizon. He's always like filling up the entire screen with the replicators. So this is all right. So again, like I'm going to make a full-blown, much better looking one here, but let's just get going here. This looks pretty good. So you notice I've got some gaps, right? So some of my replicators are being pushed up really high and the length isn't going down far enough. So there's a couple of ways we can deal with this. And the cheating way, and maybe I'll just do the cheating way, we can go back to our schematic, right? And we can adjust the, we're down here, and I told you why we named these, right? So we've got our basic mountain, scale X, scale Z. We've got our sieve mountains. We've got a random mountain, scale XZ. Where do we got? Basic X. Oh, I didn't. Of course, the name doesn't. Let's go to the item list. TY, right? So it's moving. They're moving up a little too high. So I can scale these more in Y to get them to go farther below. But I'm actually probably just going to grab my prototype here and go to my 3D view and go to poly mode and select the bottom of my prototype, and I'm just going to pull that down just to fill in the gaps here, right? Fill in the gaps. So Moto is lagging a little bit here, but so yeah, I cheated a little bit. It's not a perfect cube and blah blah blah. I just did it with a cube, but we could tweak those schematic parameters a little bit to change things, or you could put a ground plane underneath to cut off and create a shadow there. But right now we're just going to do this. So I think that looks pretty cool. I don't need this visible, by the way. We can hide that guy. So, all right, press 5, back to item mode. So this is looking pretty good. We need to add some depth of field, obviously. So let's stretch out, select your camera, press Y, and the little blue dot there, that's going to be our focal distance. So let's kind of get down there in the weeds. And over on the camera tab, let's enable depth of field. And you'll see it coming in a little bit here, but it's the f-stop isn't nearly low enough to really show a lot of depth of field. So I just turned it to 1 to get a little more depth of field here. And there's no real lighting going on. I just have default lighting, but I just want to show what we can do with a little bit of an edge bevel there. So let's just try, I can't remember the scale of our prototype off the top of my head. How big is this guy? That is, the grid's at 10 millimeters. Let me look at the top here. So it's actually fairly big. So if I look over here at my material, double tap escape, drop everything, select the material. I am getting a little bit of a, I'm not sure how well you can see that on the screen cap, but it's kind of a cool effect. A little bit of an edge bevel. That's probably too broad. So maybe I'll stick with that. It's going to catch lighting, especially down here in the ocean. You'll see that catching the lighting really well. Maybe a little too much, but again, we're just playing with some parameters here. And we've got some reflectivity going on, so let me pause this and let's add an environment that's more interesting than a gray gradient. So let's add an image maybe, see if I can find a sky. I have a sky around here somewhere I can use. I do not remember what this one looks like, but this looks sort of interesting. So let's grab this sky, open it up. Okay, it always annoys me that it never puts that in the environment. So it should be in there. Let's take a look at our texture locator, make sure it's spherically mapped. And it is. And I'm actually going to crank up. Let me unpause this. One of the things we can do, so it's a little dark here, so I might... do I have this on draft? I do not. So let me go back to draft. I had it on extended quality for some reason. Let me go to draft. And so I'm getting some more dramatic lighting here, right? And I'm just going to go to extended refinement passes. So I don't have to go in and adjust samples for subsurface scattering or samples for blurry reflections or anything like that, or samples for GI. It's just going to do that on its own. But I will bump up the GI bounces to 3, and I'm going to turn off irradiance caching. Okay, so because it's on extended refinement passes, even though that's 64, it's just going to keep throwing multiple rays at this until it looks good. So I'm going to let this render for now, and then I'll bring up a still image, and then we'll be done with part 2. So basically, you know how to do this. In part 3, I'm going to try to be even more sophisticated than what Lee Griggs has done in terms of using multiple particle sources, multiple replicators, and maybe even some animation. But in this one, I think you get the gist of how to create an interesting image, and you can use something besides a smiley face as your image and get a better looking terrain. And if you look at the Lee Griggs images, they're just super dense. I mean, there's a ton. I'm not sure how much more efficient, I don't know if XRefs and Arnold are more efficient than what Moto has natively. It might be. But you can get a lot of these guys going in Moto natively. Just be careful, like I said. You don't want to go to your particle generator and type in like 5,000, because then you're going to go on vacation for a week and come back and still going to be figuring it out, because it's going to run out of RAM on your machine and start swapping to disk, and that's what takes a long time. But so this is looking pretty cool. So, it looks kind of like a little harbor with an island. I don't know. I'll let that go on extended refinement passes. But basically what I was trying to get on this is the differences in densities and scales of the different prototypes, which we have quite a bit if you look in here. I mean, there's some vast differences in scales and densities, and subtle color variation, right? Color on altitude, color along the length, color per particle, and I think we succeeded there. I look at this, and the other aspect here is there's just an enormous number of replicators going on, far more than here. So, if I pulled the camera out, you would get this smaller, you'd see that there's more in here. But this is, I started with a 512 by 512 image, I think. And I can't remember, we wound up on the particle generator, 512 by 512 on the particle generator. So there's really like one particle per pixel here, and what we really probably need is at least a 4K image and 4K particle grid to get this sort of density in this image.